I'm Mike Archer, and my wife's name is Karen. We met back in college. She was 21, and I was 23 at the time. I was in the Army then, juggling my military duties with working toward degrees in economics and accounting. Karen, on the other hand, was studying biology. My military work wasn't exactly a 9 to 5. It was sporadic, but dangerous. Our unit specialized in covert missions, often targeting people who appeared friendly at first glance. To be blunt, we were more or less assassins. My role was in planning and close combat, two things I was pretty good at. By the time I turned 25, I had graduated, and 2 years after that, I left the Army and married Karen. For years later, we welcomed 2 daughters into the world. I worked for myself, doing accounting for local businesses and dabbling in commodity trading from home. Karen stayed busy raising the kids, but eventually landed a job at a lab tied to the local college about 10 years into our marriage. With both girls in school by then, I stayed home to make it easier for her to go back to work, a job she seemed to enjoy more than being around the family. We lived in the house I grew up in. I had bought it from my parents after they retired to Florida. Thanks to some of my Army missions, I had a bit of extra cash since our unit would occasionally split up some loot. Feeling financially comfortable, we made plans to celebrate February 1st with some of our neighborhood friends. We all got babysitters and went out for dinner and dancing at a club. There were 8 of us, and Karen and I had even reserved a room at the hotel attached to the club. Karen looked stunning that night. Slim, 5 feet 6 inches, brunette, and dressed in a silky blue dress that caught everyone's eye. The night started off great. We enjoyed the food, and the dancing was a lot of fun. Things took a turn when a group of 6 walked in, and right away, I noticed Jake Richards. He's a big deal around here, a linebacker for the local pro team. The women at our table sure noticed him too. He had a blonde on his arm, and from what our friend Beth mentioned, the woman was a cheerleader for the team and engaged to Richards, based on the massive rock on her finger. At one point, Richards made his way over to our table. He didn't even acknowledge me and went straight to Karen, asking her to dance. I tried to stop it, but she didn't even look back as she agreed to go with him. Annoyed, I made my way to the bar, walking past them as they danced. Karen didn't seem to care at all. I grabbed a coffee and sat there, watching as they moved from fast dances to a slow one. At that point, they were in each other's arms, and I was fuming. After the slow song ended, Karen casually returned to the table. I stayed at the bar, sipping my coffee, feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief. When she spotted me, she looked flustered and sat down next to Beth. I walked over and, with barely concealed frustration, commented that it seemed like she'd had her fun. Beth tried to brush it off, saying it was just a harmless dance, but I wasn't buying it. I sat down, stewing, as Karen and Beth excused themselves to the ladies' room. When Beth came back alone, I immediately asked where Karen was. That's when Beth dropped the bombshell. Karen had left with Richards. In shock, I bolted outside and spotted her climbing into a red Escalade before it sped off. I returned to the table, where Beth, now suddenly concerned, asked if anyone else knew what Karen had done. I was furious. I told Beth to let Karen enjoy her night because I sure as hell didn't need her to come back. As far as I was concerned, our marriage was over. That declaration caused quite a stir at the table, and some of our friends thought I was being too harsh. But I wasn't in the mood for their judgment. I snapped, telling them I didn't need anything from any of them. After all, they'd clearly seen what was going on and hadn't bothered to warn me. As I headed toward the coat check, I noticed the blonde who had come with Richards. She was crying, so I approached her and asked if she was his fiancée. She nodded, but through her tears, she made it clear that after tonight, she was done with him. She told me they had a house on Cherry Lane and that Richards had promised he wouldn't pull stunts like this after they got engaged. She added, somewhat bitterly, that Richards would probably be finished with Karen by morning and would smugly drop her off afterward, just to gloat at me. Her words stung, but I ignored the 2 guys at their table who seemed offended by her bluntness. I handed her my business card and told her to call me if she ever wanted to talk. She managed a weak smile through her tears as I walked away. I grabbed my coat, left Karen's behind, and headed back to the hotel room. I took my suitcase and checked out without a second thought. As I drove home, a plan started forming in my head. I had been in situations like this before, back when I was serving, and I had learned one thing. Survival depends on having a plan. Too bad I hadn't thought of this sooner. Once I got home, I parked the car in the garage, turned on the security system, and retrieved a rope I kept in the basement. I stripped down and changed into black Under Armour gear, a hoodie, dark gray sweatpants, old sneakers, and 2 pairs of gloves. I grabbed a balaclava mask and made my way to the attic. After tying the rope securely to a beam, I climbed out through a small window and rappelled down the side of the house, heading into the woods that bordered our property. I hopped the fence and went straight to my workshop, where I grabbed a backpack, some extra wool socks, and an old hand axe. I packed everything, got on my bike, and pedaled through the woods, crossing the river bridge and heading toward Cherry Lane. When I spotted the house with the football statue and the red Escalade, I knew I had found the right place. Using the axe, I smashed the passenger side window of the Escalade, setting off the alarm. I hid behind a porch pillar, waiting. As soon as the door opened, I moved quickly, delivering 2 swift blows with the axe to the man standing there. Then I closed the door and jogged off into the night. I jumped over the stone wall, grabbed my bike, and pulled out the wool socks. I stuffed the axe, knife, gloves, and shoes into the backpack, zipped it up tight, and pedaled toward the river. Near the bridge, I stopped and chucked the whole backpack as far as I could into the rushing water. The river was swollen from the rain the night before, and the current was strong. There'd be no retrieving that bag. I rode back home through the woods, slipping inside the workshop when I arrived. I changed into a fresh pair of socks and swapped my sneakers for another pair. Then I sprayed the bike's handles and pedals with an ammonia solution, carefully wiping everything down. After that, I jogged back, jumped the fence, and climbed the side of the house. It was tougher than I remembered, but I managed to pull myself up and squeeze through the small attic window. Once inside, I reeled in the rope and wiped the windowsill clean with a rag. Back in the basement, I stripped off everything, clothes, mask, gloves, and tossed it all into the washing machine. I showered in the basement bathroom for a long time, scrubbing twice just to be sure. When I was done, I threw on a pair of exercise shorts and headed upstairs, leaving the basement door open so I'd hear when the washer finished. I stood there for a moment, thinking about everything that had just gone down. Then I decided to slip into the same clothes I had worn to the club. Back in the basement, I transferred my wet clothes to the dryer and went back upstairs. I made myself a quick snack, poured a shot of whiskey, and sat there for a while, letting it all sink in. When the dryer finally stopped, I took the clothes upstairs and put them away. The balaclava mask went back into its usual spot in the closet. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:50 a.m. Everything, from the moment I left the club until now, had only taken a couple of hours. I went downstairs, poured myself another whiskey, and crashed on the couch. Sometime later, I woke up to the doorbell ringing. Groggy, I checked the door camera and saw 2 figures, a black woman and a white guy with a crew cut, both in plain clothes. Cops. The bell rang again, and I opened the door. They introduced themselves as Detective Ross and Detective Carter, flashing their badges. I played dumb, asking if something had happened to Karen and feigning concern for her safety. They assured me that she wasn't physically harmed but mentioned that Jake Richards had been attacked. I invited them in and immediately asked where Karen was. The white detective told me she was in the hospital, being treated for shock. I paused, looking them both over as they sat in separate chairs across from me. I gestured toward the couch, offering them a seat, but they declined. Instead, Detective Carter got straight to the point, asking me what I had been up to since Karen left the club with Richards. His partner, Detective Ross, chimed in, insisting I tell them everything. I didn't flinch. I explained that I had gone back to the hotel, packed my things, and driven home. After that, I drank enough to knock me out and fell asleep on the couch. They asked if anyone else had been in the house, and I told them no, the kids were with a sitter. When they pressed about phone calls or emails, I told them I hadn't made any and that I hadn't left the house. Detective Ross glanced around the room, noticing the security system. She asked about its coverage, and I offered to show them. We went upstairs to my office, where I sat at my desk and pulled up the system's data. I downloaded everything from 6 p.m. to the time they arrived and handed them a jump drive. I explained that the system covered the front, side, and patio doors, but the side of the house I had come down wasn't covered. It faced the woods and had two large, non-opening windows. Carter said they'd need to take my computer with them. I pushed back a little, saying they could have messed with the data before getting here, but Carter reassured me they'd only need it for a day. I agreed, but only after downloading the same data to an external drive for myself. They looked around the house while I did that, but I made sure they stayed together and didn't wander off. After taking a few pictures, they finally left. It was around 7:10 a.m. by then, and I figured it was time to call Karen's parents. Paul and Diane lived in the next neighborhood over, but they were at their lake house at the time. When I told them what had happened, Paul seemed genuinely shocked by Karen's behavior. Diane, on the other hand, wasn't surprised at all. She asked if I planned to see Karen in the hospital, but I made it clear I had no interest in facing her after what she'd done. I mentioned that Richard's getting attacked was unfortunate, but that wasn't on me. Apparently, he had a history of this kind of behavior. I also told them that when Karen got out of the hospital, she'd need to stay away from me in the house. We'd figure out how to get her things to her later. Paul suggested that I should leave and let Karen stay in the house, but I shut that down quickly. It was my house, bought and paid for, not some community property to be divided up. After that call, I rang my parents down in Florida to tell them everything. They were just as shocked as I had been about Karen's betrayal. My dad even mentioned seeing something on the news about Richards being attacked and killed at his home. That wasn't news to me. Then the landline rang. It was Sarah. She wanted to know where Karen was, having heard about Jake's death. I told Sarah that Karen was in the hospital, dealing with shock, and made it clear I had no intention of visiting her. Sarah tried to push me into supporting Karen, but I shot that down fast. After everything she had done, there was no way I'd ever be there for her again. Sarah didn't take it well, calling me a pig before hanging up on me. I just shrugged it off. After another shower, I got dressed and went to pick up the kids from the sitter around 8 a.m. When we got home, the girls asked where their mom was. I told them she wouldn't be home that day and suggested we stick to our routine. We got ready for soccer. I took them to their games at noon and 1:30, sitting back and relaxing as I watched them play. Afterward, we grabbed some ice cream before heading home. Once we got back, I noticed several messages waiting on my muted phone. One was from Karen's parents, saying she was at St. Jude's Hospital and wasn't talking. Another was from a doctor there, asking me to call. Then there was a message from Sarah, saying Karen was with the police but refusing to speak, and that I should cool off and bring the girls to see her. I called the girls downstairs and sat them down, figuring I had to tell them something. I explained that their mom was in the hospital, emotionally messed up but physically fine. They asked what happened, and I decided to be straight with them. Your mom left with a famous football player last night, went back to his place, and, well, they were going to have some fun together. There's no easy way to say this, and I thought about keeping it from you, but you'd find out eventually. I paused, watching their faces. Someone attacked the football player. He's dead, but your mom wasn't hurt. She must have found him after it happened, and now she's in shock. The girls were hesitant about visiting her, but I told them to get dressed anyway. We were going to the hospital. I called Dr. Emily Parker, the psychiatrist handling Karen's case, and she explained Karen was catatonic, completely shut down emotionally. I asked if it might help to bring the kids. The doctor hesitated, but eventually agreed. When she asked if the girls knew about the affair, I told her they did. We arrived at the hospital, and Dr. Parker met us outside Karen's room. She was in her late 30s, calm but direct. She explained that their mom was in severe shock, and seeing the girls might help bring her out of it. The girls said they wanted to see her, so I walked them to the door. Karen was sitting up in bed, blankly staring at cartoons playing on the TV. Emily, my oldest, gently touched her hand and called her Mom, but Karen didn't even blink. Shelley, my youngest, followed suit but got no response either. Shelley started to cry, so I picked her up, trying to comfort her, while taking Emily's hand to lead them both out of the room. I reassured them we had done our best, and Emily asked if their mom would wake up. I told her, she will, eventually. It might take some time, but she will. Shelley, still whispering through her tears, asked, "What if she doesn't wake up?" I tried to sound confident, but the truth was I didn't know. "She will," I said softly. "I'm sure." Dr. Parker chimed in, saying she'd let us know as soon as Karen showed any signs of recovery. We left the hospital with both girls crying in the car, and I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made the wrong choice by bringing them. As much as I was furious with Karen, I didn't wish this on her. Sure, she deserved to suffer for what she did, but not like this. I felt a few tears slip down my cheeks as I drove. Back at home, I made eggs and toast with the girls, getting them involved in the cooking to distract them. Then I put on a movie for them and headed into my office to make a few calls. I reached out to a friend of mine, a public defender, and asked if he could dig up any information on what had gone down at Richard's house after I left. He couldn't get his hands on police reports, but said ambulance records might be publicly available. I told him to do his best and hung up. While the girls watched their movie, I mulled over what might happen next. A little while later, my friend called back with the ambulance report. He forwarded it to me, and reading through it, my stomach churned. It detailed how the police found Karen cradling Richard's head in her lap, covered in his blood, wearing nothing but a thin robe and whispering "no" over and over. She hadn't responded when they asked her what happened, and they took her to the hospital, where she had been unresponsive ever since. I felt sick. Would she ever come out of this? I knew enough about PTSD from my time in the Army, and I had read about people going into catatonic states due to trauma. Sometimes they came back. Other times, the damage lingered. I called Joan Drake, a lawyer a friend had recommended, and set up an appointment for Monday morning. She gave me her cell number just in case the police came knocking before then, but nothing happened that night. Sunday passed quietly. The girls and I spent the day lounging around the house, trying to reassure them that their mom would eventually come back to us. Deep down, I was torn. Part of me wondered how Karen would react when she saw me. Did she remember anything? If she did, what could she recall? I had been covered from head to toe in black with a mask on. There was no way she could have known it was me. Or could she? By Monday morning, I sent the girls off to school and kept an eye on the local news. The story about Richard's death was everywhere. Although Karen's name wasn't mentioned in the news, it was clear to anyone paying attention that she had been with Jake Richards during the attack. The police were called by a neighbor who heard her screaming, and so far, the authorities had kept our names out of the public eye. But I knew it was only a matter of time before that changed. I met with Joan Drake, my lawyer, a sharp-looking blonde, probably in her mid-40s. After going over the story and reviewing the ambulance report, she was visibly shocked by the whole situation. I reassured her that my security systems footage was untouched, and I needed my computer back from the police for work. She called the station and spoke with Detective Ross, requesting its return. I'd already done some digging on PTSD and shock-induced catatonic states, learning that people usually recover from catatonia, but the effects of PTSD could last for years. Joan scheduled an appointment for me to meet her on Monday at 9:30 a.m., and she gave me her cell in case the police showed up before then, though they hadn't. She assured me there was enough time to verify that the security footage hadn't been tampered with, and I agreed, telling her to send someone to retrieve the computer the next morning. Joan arranged for her office to pick it up at 9 a.m. sharp. I also told her I wasn't planning to talk to the cops unless I had my phone ready to record any conversations. She understood. That afternoon, I picked the girls up from school. They immediately asked about their mom, and I told them there wasn't any change. We sat down for homework, and later, I ordered pizza for dinner. I tried to lighten the mood, joking that if Karen didn't come back soon, I'd have to start learning how to cook properly. That got a few laughs out of them, even though I'm not bad in the kitchen. I just don't do it often. Later that evening, after Shelley had gone upstairs, Emily asked me something that stopped me in my tracks. "Dad, do you think you could ever forgive Mom for being with another man?" I paused before answering, "Right now, all I want is for her to get better." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was what Emily needed to hear. Then the landline rang. It was Rob Harris from the local paper, The Trib. He told me they had information suggesting Karen was with Jake Richards when he was killed and asked me to confirm. I tried to keep it private, explaining how this could hurt my two girls in school, but he pressed on, saying, "This information is going to come out either way." Reluctantly, I confirmed it was true. Then he asked how I felt about my wife's lover being dead. I kept my composure, but I made it very clear that if their story caused harm to my family, there would be legal consequences. Rob didn't back down, though. "This is going to come out, Mr. Archer," he said bluntly. I glanced out the window and saw a TV truck parked in front of the house. I see a news van outside, I replied. I guess you're right. I need to go now. I hung up. Not long after, there was a knock at the door. Checking the camera feed, I saw a young woman holding a microphone. She was from one of the local news stations. I spoke through the intercom, telling her to leave and warning that she was trespassing. Is your wife there, Mr. Archer? She asked, ignoring my warning. I called the local precinct, requesting that they clear the media from my property. They sent a few officers, and while the group of reporters left the porch, the news van stayed parked out front. For in total, I immediately called Karen's doctor and asked her to secure Karen in the hospital before the press could make things worse. I also started talking to the girls about the possibility of moving, but they were adamant about staying in their current school, even if we had to live somewhere else temporarily. I told them I'd think about it. Next, I reached out to Joan for advice. She suggested issuing a public statement to hopefully calm the situation. Her office released a short statement, asking for privacy and refusing to comment on the rumors surrounding my wife. It warned that if the media continued to harass my family, legal action would be taken. The statement also requested that the media leave our property. That night, Detective Ross and her commanding officer held a press conference at 7 p.m. I watched it closely. The police confirmed that Jake Richards had been attacked and killed with a sharp object outside his home. They mentioned that a woman was inside the house at the time, but emphasized there was no indication she had witnessed the attack. The investigation was still ongoing. The first question from the reporters was about the woman's marital status and whether her husband was a suspect. The police acknowledged that the woman was indeed married, but after thoroughly investigating her husband, they found no signs of his involvement. In fact, they confirmed that he had been at home all night. One reporter asked if this involved other married women, especially in relation to Richards' past behavior. The police admitted that there were credible reports of Richards seducing multiple married women, even when their husbands were present, and this was part of the investigation. Commander Paulson wrapped up the press conference, saying they would provide any additional information at the next briefing, scheduled for Wednesday. By the time the police left, reporters were shouting more questions, but the conference was over. I made arrangements with the girls' school to have their assignments sent home for the next few days, just in case things got worse. I called Karen's parents to give them a heads up about the media. Though no reporters had shown up at their place yet, I wanted them to be prepared just in case. By then, the press had also cleared out from our street, but I knew that was probably temporary. On Tuesday, the doctor called to tell me Karen had started responding again, and the police were with her. I immediately informed her parents and took the girls to the hospital. By the time we arrived, the officers were just leaving. Detective Ross stopped me on the way in, saying he wanted to talk. I agreed, but first I needed to see Karen with the girls. Karen looked dazed, but she managed to greet the girls with weak smiles and hugs. Her interaction with me, however, was distant, almost non-existent. The girls told her about the TV trucks at their school, but Karen didn't seem to register much of what they said, and she quickly drifted off. The doctor suggested we let her rest, so I took the opportunity to have that talk with Detective Ross. As we stepped into the hallway, Ross mentioned that Karen seemed to be recovering. I told him, maybe she is, but I honestly don't know. He asked if I intended to bring her home once she recovered, and I shrugged, saying it wasn't about punishment but about respect and trust. I'll never trust her again, I said, and I doubt she respects me either. Ross gave me a knowing smile, suggesting that maybe Karen was afraid of me, just as I didn't trust her. He then speculated about my military background, implying that while a regular person might not have been able to carry out Richard's murder, someone like me, someone with my skill set, might have. I pushed back, insisting I had nothing to do with Richard's death. I reminded him that the security footage backed me up, but he shrugged, saying it wasn't his problem. As he walked off, he left me with a parting shot. I'll be seeing you around. Over the next few days, Karen started to act more like herself, though I still kept my distance. I brought the girls to see her each day, but I rarely stayed in the room for long. On the fourth day, Karen was set to be discharged. She asked for a private conversation, so I sent the girls out. Sitting across from me, she apologized. She admitted that what she'd done was more than just embarrassing. It had been a betrayal, and she knew it would take more than words to make it right. Karen said she wanted to come home, acknowledging the media circus and the toll it might take on the girls if she didn't. She even suggested sneaking out to avoid attracting attention. I couldn't help myself. I gave her a long, hard look and said, "You're pretty good at sneaking out, aren't you?" She didn't meet my eyes, but mentioned checking with security about it. I told her the truth. I didn't really want to be around her, but I didn't have many options right now. I also confessed that, despite everything, I hadn't wanted her to be hurt. When the topic of Richards came up, I asked if she'd slept with him. Karen claimed they were in bed, undressed. When the commotion started, I stared at her, knowing full well she was lying. I couldn't bring myself to believe anything she said. Trusting her again wasn't even a possibility. I suggested we see how things went moving forward, but I made it clear I couldn't trust her again. Despite it all, I told her I still loved her. Then, I walked out. Later, I made arrangements with hospital security to have a car pick Karen up behind the building and bring her home. The plan went off without a hitch, and she arrived around 4:45 p.m. Her parents and the girls were already there. I'd set up a bed in my office for myself, while Karen would sleep in our room. The rest of the day was awkward. Karen, her mom, and the girls played Monopoly in the living room while her dad and I stepped out to the patio to talk. Paul asked what I planned to do. I admitted I wasn't sure, but the odds were that this marriage was over. He encouraged me to try to forgive her, mentioning the long history of love between us and the family we'd built. I wasn't so sure anymore. Paul seemed just as conflicted, troubled by Karen's actions and her claims about not feeling close to me. We both knew there were bigger concerns, like the possibility of disease or pregnancy if she hadn't used protection. Paul grimaced at the thought but agreed that Karen could stay for now, though he urged me to figure out a more permanent solution soon. We went back inside for dinner, pizza again, and after eating, her parents headed home. As far as I knew, they hadn't mentioned the situation with Jake to her. When I tucked the girls into bed, Emily, still trying to make sense of everything, asked Karen, "Why did you go to have lovemaking with Jake?" Karen apologized, admitting she'd made a terrible mistake. Emily seemed confused, pointing out that Jake wasn't their dad. Karen promised to explain everything later when she could, and with that, the girls went asleep. Karen wandered off to the kitchen, and about 10 minutes later, I followed her in. I made a call to my public defender friend to check on the autopsy report. He confirmed it was a public document and agreed to get it for me. Meanwhile, Karen, sipping on a Pepsi, asked if I'd be sleeping in our room that night. "No," I said. "I'll be in the office." She welcomed me anytime but acknowledged the uncertainty of our future. I didn't say anything, and after a while, she suggested we be patient. It had only been a week, after all. I went up to the office and tried to sleep, but it didn't come easy. At 5 a.m., I gave up, made some coffee, and checked my email. The autopsy report had come through. As I read it, a sick feeling settled in my gut. The analysis of Richard's injuries was one thing, but what really caught my attention was the mention of biological evidence. There was ejaculate and female secretions found on Richard's body. It became clear that Karen had lied about not being intimate with Jake. I'd suspected it based on the timing of everything, but now I had the hard proof: her presence at the scene 2 hours before the murder, and now the autopsy results. Despite this knowledge, we carried on with our morning routine, getting the girls off to school. They were a little quieter than usual, but we managed. As I drove them, I thought about my options. If it weren't for Karen's fragile state, I'd never have let her back into the house. But having her there had its advantages, especially for the girls. It might stabilize things for a while. When I got back home, another TV truck rolled up. A young reporter jumped out, shouting if Karen was home and if I had forgiven her. I forced a smile, waved, and told her not to step onto my property. Then I went inside. Karen had made biscuits, offering me one. I took it, and she mentioned the TV truck outside. Unsure if they knew I was home, she suggested maybe they shouldn't. I asked what they wanted, but I already knew. My name and details about what had happened at Richard's house had been all over the news. Karen asked if the media could do any more damage. I told her, they'll always find something. She stared at me, as if waiting for something more. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, unsure if I meant her or us. I told her I wanted her to write down everything that happened last Friday, From when she left the club to when she ended up in the hospital. It doesn't have to be right now, but soon. Karen agreed, admitting that it might be difficult but that she'd try. Then she mentioned needing to call her job to check if she still had it. I couldn't help but scoff. Why would you lose your job for cheating on me? I asked. I doubt they care. She explained that she had been out for a week and was worried, but after calling, she found out they'd let her use her sick leave for last week and take the next on vacation time. Relieved, she went to the bedroom to type on her computer. I left her alone and went to my office to dig into the autopsy materials. I'd been waiting on test results, but they wouldn't be ready for a few more days. Karen was trying to act normal around me, but I knew she had questions about what really happened. We went through our routine for the next 2 days until the results finally came in. The autopsy confirmed what I suspected. Karen's DNA was found on Richard's, proving she had lied about not sleeping with him. I waited for her to give me her version of events, but deep down, I knew there was no way I could keep living with her as my wife. The following evening, after dinner, Karen came into my office with a piece of paper. "I've finished writing it," she said, handing me the printout. I took a deep breath and started reading. In her note, Karen apologized for her weakness and explained how things unfolded. She wrote about how excited she was when Jake asked her to dance. His charm and reputation captivated her, and while they danced, she stopped thinking about anything else. During a slow song, she described how she was drawn to him, how his size and presence overwhelmed her. At that moment, she admitted she would have slept with him right there on the dance floor. She recounted how Jake suggested they slip out the side door and head to his place, promising her the coital experience of her life. She believed him. When the song ended and I wasn't at the table, she decided to go to the women's room with Beth. She knew I was angry, but she figured I'd cool off eventually. Her desire for Jake won out, and they left the club together. She wrote that Jake kissed her as soon as they got to his house, then carried her upstairs to his bed. They had sex, and afterward, she cleaned him and performed another sexual act. That's when a car alarm went off. Jake told her to stay in the room, and he went outside to check. She peeked out the window but couldn't see much beyond the porch roof. Then, she saw someone dressed in black running away and jumping the fence. She found a robe, went downstairs, and saw Jake lying in the driveway with his head smashed in. She felt sick, as if it were her fault for what had happened. The police arrived soon after, and she ended up in the hospital. At the end of the letter, she apologized again, saying she was confused and didn't understand why she had done what she did. She claimed she still loved me, despite everything. I looked up from the paper to see tears streaming down her face. She asked, "Were you the person I saw that night?" I stared at her, then calmly replied, "I was home all night, drinking and trying to come to terms with the end of our marriage." I told her the police had confirmed my alibi with the security footage. She nodded but didn't seem fully convinced. Before she could press further, I added, "Richards got what he deserved." Karen shook her head, insisting that Jake didn't deserve to die like that. She said he was a good man and that his death had impacted her deeply. "We don't need to go there," I said, cutting her off. "I will never love you again. Not the way I used to. The woman I thought I married would never have done this." I asked her flat out if sleeping with him was worth it, worth destroying everything we had. Tears still in her eyes, Karen admitted that, while the sex was incredible, it wasn't worth what she had lost. She reflected on how different things might have been if Richards hadn't been killed, and how our lives were now irreparably changed. At that moment, she looked at me, her expression hardening. "You killed him," she whispered, before running out of the room. Under my breath, I muttered, "No, you did." From that day on, our relationship became ice cold. I made a firm decision not to try to convince her of my innocence, nor did I want to salvage what was left of our marriage. I realized that if I ever admitted the truth to her, she would betray me to the authorities without a second thought. Karen had essentially admitted that if Jake Richards hadn't been killed, the night she spent with him would have been worth the fallout. Maybe she didn't say it outright, but the meaning was clear. That was enough for me. I filed for divorce. A few weeks later, I went for custody of the kids, so they could stay in the house. Karen still had her job, so I didn't ask for alimony, and I proposed no child support either, with liberal visitation rights for her. She had recovered enough by then that I told her she needed to move out. She wanted to stay with her parents, and I had the divorce papers served there. Not long after, her father called, asking me to reconsider. He said Karen was distraught, but I wasn't about to budge. I told him she should be distraught and advised her to get a lawyer. He was furious, though I couldn't tell if he was mad at me or her. He asked about visitation, and I said she could come over any time in the evening and stay with the girls until they went to bed. The very next day, Karen showed up at 5 o'clock. I had made macaroni and cheese, and we all sat down to dinner together. Afterward, we played board games with the girls and tucked them in for the night. Once they were asleep, Karen said she wanted to talk. I shut that down, telling her there was nothing left to work out between us. She pushed back, saying we needed to figure things out for the girls' sake, that they would have to adjust to us being apart. She even suggested finding a place where she could have them over, emphasizing that the sooner the divorce was settled, the easier things would be for everyone. She apologized again for her mistake and told me she still loved me, but I wasn't interested. I made it clear there was no way I could stay married to her after everything that had happened. She started crying softly, and though I felt a twinge of sympathy, it wasn't enough to change my mind. Our marriage was done. The divorce went through, and we agreed on joint custody. Karen moved into an apartment with a second bedroom for the girls. Over time, we settled into a distant, but civil, co-parenting relationship focused solely on raising them. About 4 months after the divorce, I started dating again. Women from our social circle, women from work. They knew I was single and seemed drawn to me. When Karen had the girls, I'd bring women home for the night. None of those relationships lasted long, but the sex was usually good, sometimes even great. I avoided married women, though a few of them made it clear they were interested. After everything I'd been through, I just couldn't go there. It didn't feel right. Karen, on the other hand, was struggling. She was good with the girls, but alone, she wasn't doing well. She was on antidepressants and spent a lot of time sleeping. Still, she managed to keep her job and function, but her spark was gone. From what her parents and the girls told me, she wasn't dating anyone. Fast forward 10 years. Today, Shelley went off to college, and Emily is about to start her junior year. The girls adjusted well to the joint custody arrangement and grew up healthy, dating in high school and now in college. As for me, I've been in a long-term relationship with a younger woman named Stacy. We met at a bar one night when I was out with some friends. She was divorced, like me, and had 2 kids in high school. Her ex-husband had moved to the West Coast, leaving her to raise the kids. We clicked instantly, and before long, she moved into my house. Stacy wasn't as strikingly beautiful as Karen, but she was attractive, smart, and full of energy. We had great chemistry, both in and out of the bedroom. When we were out, guys would still turn their heads to check her out. Early on, I told Stacy about everything that had happened with Jake Richards, though I left out the details of how he died. By then, the publicity had died down, and no one was ever arrested or charged. Life had moved on. One Saturday, Detective Carter showed up at my house. I invited him in, and we chatted for a bit. He'd recently retired and was enjoying his pension. I congratulated him, then asked why he had stopped by. He got straight to the point. "I've always been convinced that you took care of Richards," he said. "And to be honest, I think he deserved it. Maybe not your wife, but him?" "Absolutely." I denied any involvement, of course. Carter just smiled, saying, "Whoever did it, good for them." I asked why he thought Karen didn't deserve what happened. He explained that it was just one night, something a lot of married women might do if the right guy came along. "If it had been a quiet affair, maybe you could have gotten past it," he said. "But it was too out in the open, too public. That's what made it different." Before he left, Carter mentioned that his partner had made captain, and we shook hands. It was a strange, almost cordial goodbye. As for Karen, she eventually started piecing her life back together. One day, we were driving Shelley to school, and on the way back, I asked her how she was doing. She admitted she had a boyfriend now, more of a friend with benefits, really. I told her about Stacy, explaining that we were living together and might even get married once her kids went off to college. Karen whispered, "I wish none of this had happened. We could have been empty nesters, having fun together." She apologized again, and for a brief moment, we both broke down, crying over the mess we had made of our lives. Karen moved into her friend's apartment after that, but I don't think she ever truly recovered from what happened. And maybe, in a way, neither did I. I don't regret taking care of Richards. It felt like a necessary act, maybe even an altruistic one. He probably saved a few marriages by not being around anymore.